Sophie is my name. I'm 54 years old, and I live in sunny California. My days are balanced between maintaining my health and fitness and taking care of our house with my husband, David. Although this picture seems ideal, with its gorgeous beaches, golden sunrises, and the tranquil pace of suburban life, there is more to it than meets the eye. Although David appears to be a kind man, his true nature is more complex. I love my morning runs by the ocean, my yoga sessions on our sunny patio, and the time I get to try new recipes in our lively kitchen. But during these quiet moments, my thoughts frequently stray to Ethan. He is loyal and works hard on his business trips, which frequently take him away for days. David's 19-year-old son, Ethan, is a member of our family, and we have a natural and unique bond. I consider him to be my son. He was hesitant around big dreams when he was younger, but now he's a self-assured, athletic, and energetic young man. As the years have gone by, we've become closer. I often find myself watching him when he visits. He has a presence that fills the room, and his broad shoulders, strong jawline, and the way he moves with ease make him impossible to ignore. There's something magnetic about him, a quiet energy that's almost tangible, but he's always humble, offering to help around the house or just listen when I need someone to talk to. I know how wrong my thoughts might be. After all, I'm married, and Ethan is still young and just beginning to explore the world, but there's something about him that makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. When I'm with him, I feel like I'm seeing things differently, noticing things I used to miss, like the way sunlight shines on the ocean, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, or even the beat of my own heart. The change in our relationship happened slowly. I can't point to one specific moment, but I know it started during one of David's business trips. Ethan stopped by to drop off some papers for David, and we ended after talking for hours. We sat on the porch as the sky turned a soft purple. He shared his dreams of becoming a filmmaker, the stories he wanted to tell, and the places he wanted to visit. His passion was contagious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of adventure in me. But with this new feeling came a quiet unease. I found myself wanting to spend more time with him, coming up with reasons to ask for his help or inviting him over for dinner when David was away. Every time he smiled at me with that easy boyishness, I felt warmth spread through my chest. It was a warm warmth that excited me and scared me at the same time. I tell myself that it's harmless, that the flutter in my chest is just admiration for a young man full of potential. But deep down, I know there's more to it. I see it in the way his eyes linger on mine a moment longer than usual, how his voice softens when he talks to me, and how he always seems to be drawn to me, even in a crowded room. There's an unspoken connection between us, an energy that neither of us says anything about. But we both feel as I write this. I find myself wondering where this is leading. It was late afternoon when Ethan arrived at our door without calling first. His warm smile lit up the room as he entered. David had left for Dallas earlier that morning for one of his lengthy business trips, so I was left to deal with the silence alone. Ethan held up a bag of groceries and smiled shyly. "I thought you might need some company, Sophie," he said, adding that his voice was kind and genuine. As a result, I figured I'd bring dinner. We moved into the kitchen, and soon the air was filled with the sound of clinking utensils and the delicious smells of dinner coming together. Ethan worked beside me, chopping vegetables and stirring sauces like he had done it 100 times. I couldn't help but notice how much he had changed over the years. He was more confident now, moving with the ease of someone completely comfortable in their own skin as we cooked. I laughed a little, surprised but pleased by the thoughtful gesture. "You didn't have to do that, but I won't complain about the help," I said. I was taken aback by the question, so I took a moment to wipe my hands on a dish towel and gazed into his eyes. He told me about a school project he was working on, and his voice was full of excitement as he described the characters and the plot. Besides his words, his passion in his eyes and soft laugh fascinated me. "Tell me, Sophie," he said, leaning against the counter with his hands still covered in flour. "What would you do if you could start over? No limits, no responsibilities, just you." I don't know whether I acknowledged it, but I suppose it's been a while since I had that notion about myself. Maybe I'd travel, see the world beyond these walls, do something bold. His smile was warm and encouraging. "You should. You're the most dynamic person I know. It's hard to imagine you not being bold the compliment hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt my cheeks flush and turn away, busying myself with the salad, but I could feel his eyes on me, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race. After dinner, we moved to the living room. The soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the walls. I poured us each a glass of wine, and we talked for hours, moving easily from one topic to the next. I couldn't remember the last time I felt so alive, so truly seen. At one point, Ethan leaned back on the couch. His gaze softened as he looked at me. He said, his voice quieter now, "I always thought you were incredible, even when I was a kid, but now I don't know if it's different." The words lingered in the air, akin to a secret that neither of us could articulate. I searched his face for answers, some hint of what he meant, but all I saw was sincerity, an honesty that made my heart ache. I began, but he gently interrupted me with a shake of his head, saying, "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know how much you mean to me, Sophie." His words left me stunned, and my mind raced with thoughts I couldn't express. I felt a strange mix of emotions, warmth, confusion, and longing, all tangled together in a way I couldn't explain. The room felt smaller somehow, and the air between us felt charged with something I couldn't name. As the evening went on, the silence between us grew heavier, filled with all the things presence wasn't saying. Ethan stayed close. His presence was a constant reminder of the bond we shared. When it was time for him to leave, I walked him to the door. The cool night air brushed against my skin as the evening went on. The silence between us grew heavier, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Ethan stayed close. His presence a constant reminder of the bond we shared. When it was time for him to leave, I walked him to the door. The cool night air brushed against my skin as I held it open. "Thank you for tonight," I said, my voice softer than I meant it was nice. He smiled, that same easy, boyish grin that always made me feel at ease. It was more than nice, Sophie. It was perfect for a moment. Neither of us moved. The space between us felt charged, as if the air itself was holding its breath. And then, without warning, he reached out his hand and brushed against mine. The touch was almost accidental, but it sent a shock through me, leaving me breathless. He said good night in a low, unsaid voice. "Good night, Ethan," I answered, my heart pounding as I watched him drive away and disappear into the night. I leaned against the door and closed it, my mind a whirlpool of emotions I couldn't untangle. There was no doubting that something was changing between us, something that felt both right and exciting, dangerous and impossible to ignore. I told myself to let it go, to bury these feelings before they grew into something I couldn't control, but deep down I knew it was already too late. The spark had been lit, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur of restless energy, with Ethan on my mind like a song I couldn't stop humming, his words and the way he looked at me playing over and over again. I tried to keep myself occupied, extending my morning runs, spending more time at the gym, and organizing the house, but nothing could calm the storm that was building inside of me. It wasn't long before he called again. His voice was warm and casual as he asked if I needed help fixing a leaky faucet. David had been planning to fix the faucet, but before I could stop myself, I said yes to Ethan's offer to help. It was as if the words had been waiting to escape. When Ethan arrived, I opened the door to find him standing there. His usual easy confidence on display. He had a toolbox in one hand and a bottle of sparkling water in the other. He greeted me with that smile that made my heart brace. "Yourself. Let's see what we're working with," he said, stepping inside like he belonged there, eh? Indeed, in some ways, he did. The afternoon went by with an ease that felt almost naturally. I sat on the kitchen counter watching as he knelt under the sink, his hands skillfully tightening bolts and replacing washers. His shirt stuck to his back, damp with the effort, and I found myself watching the way his muscles moved under the fabric. I tried to shake off the thoughts, but they wouldn't leave. "All done," he said, leaning back to admire his workout. "Is leak-free now." "Thank you," I replied, sliding the fitting off the counter. My voice sounded softer, warmer than I meant. "You've saved me again." He grinned and wiped his hands on a rag. The air felt charged with something I couldn't identify, and I wanted to say something to ease the tension, but before I could, he spoke again. "You look amazing today." His voice was low, his eyes met mine, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. "I like helping you. It feels good." There was something in his tone, a quiet sincerity that made my chest tighten. I wasn't sure what to respond at first, but he went on, "I mean it." I chuckled quietly, though my voice was unsteady, as he remarked, "You always look good, but I don't know where you're glowing today." I said, "It's just from the gym," trying to dismiss it, but he shook his head and said, "It's you." The words hung heavy and unavoidable between us, and I turned away, my heart racing, but he moved closer, his presence overwhelming. The intensity in his eyes caused my knees to weaken when I finally met his gaze again. "You shouldn't," I whispered, but I hardly said anything. "Why not? Why shouldn't I tell you?" He questioned steadily. He reached for my hand, a firm yet gentle touch that sent a chill up my spine. "You're incredible, Sophie," he said, his voice softening. "You've always been incredible, Sophie, and I know I shouldn't say this, but I can't help it when I look at you." Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of guilt and longing. Twisting in my chest, "Ethan," I whispered, my voice shaking, "this isn't right." His voice broke slightly as he said, "It's not why I asked. Is DV the cause?" Notwithstanding the age gap, I withdrew my hand. "You have your entire life ahead of you. You don't need this," I whispered, my voice trembling, even though removing his touch felt like a wound. "You're necessary to me." His statements were forceful and cutting. He said, "You don't have to say anything," in a soft whisper. "I just needed you to know." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak because the room felt too small and the air was heavy with everything we weren't saying. I needed to get away to clear my head before I did something I couldn't undo. "I've needed you for as long as I can remember." His confession left me speechless, prompting me to turn away from him and encircle myself with my arms, as if to protect my heart from the impact of his words. However, he refused to let me retreat. "I needed some air," I said, grabbing my jacket and stepping out the back door. The cool evening breeze hit my face. Grounding me for a moment, I stood on the porch, staring at the darkening sky, trying to make sense of everything I was feeling before long. I heard the door behind me open. Ethan stepped outside, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He didn't say anything, just standing beside me. His presence felt like a steady anchor in the storm of my thoughts. The silence stretched between us, full of unspoken words. Then, without warning, he reached for my hand again, his fingers intertwining with mine this time. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The world seemed to hold its breath as we stood there side by side, caught in a moment that felt like the edge of something we couldn't control. The days that followed felt like a blur. Ethan stayed on my mind like a song. I couldn't stop humming every time I thought of his touching, how his fingers had held mine on the porch. My chest tightened with longing. I couldn't admit it wasn't until the following Friday evening that Ethan came by again. David had called earlier to say he'd extended his trip for another 2 days, leaving me alone for the weekend when Ethan knocked on the door. His smile was bright and easy as always. I felt the air shift, the same tension from before bubbling just beneath the surface. "I thought you might like some company," he said, holding up a box of my favorite wine for movie night. He hesitated for a moment. The rational part of my mind screamed at me to say no, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped aside and let him, and we settled into the living room. The lights were dim, and a classic movie played softly in the background. Ethan had brought popcorn and snacks, and we laughed, teasing each other about the cheesy dialogue. It felt normal and familiar like every other time he'd come over. But there was a difference now, a charge in the air that neither of us could ignore. At one point, I reached for the popcorn bowl, just as Ethan did. Our hands brushed, and the contact sent a jolt through me. I gasped, and when I looked up, I saw that he was already observing me. His eyes glowed with a darkness that made my heart race. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice hardly audible above a whisper. I tried to pull my hand back, but he caught it, his grip gentle but firm. "Don't," he said, his eyes holding mine. "Don't pretend you don't feel it too much." I voiced, "Is he?" I opened. His eyes glowed with a darkness that made my heart race. That comes out because he was right. I did feel it, the pull, the connection, the undeniable heat that seemed to grow every time we were near each other. And it scared me that this isn't right, Ethan. "Whatever this is, Sophie," he said, gesturing between us. "We can't, why not?" I controlled my shaking voice. In a tone of silent despair, he broke off. Why are we unable to? You don't understand, Ethan. I've been watching you, admiring you, and desiring you for years, and now I simply want you to see me the way I see you. His comments were so sincere and raw that they made me gasp. This may ruin everything, Sophie, I muttered, scarcely able to speak. Or perhaps everything he said was in a softer voice that was now filled with love. I've never felt this way about anyone before, and I doubt I ever will again. Tears pricked my eyes as I turned my head away to collect my thoughts. But before I could do so, Ethan reached out and gently brushed his fingers against my cheek, turning my face back to him. His voice was low and full of control, and he said, "Just tell me to stop." The silence between us was thick and suffocating, and every heartbeat was a loud reminder of the decision I was about to make. Then, without thinking, I leaned forward and kissed him, and his eyes searched mine with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Sophie," he began, but I shook my head, pressing my finger to his lips. "Don't you?" I trembled and whispered. Just for a moment, we sat there with the world shrinking to just the two of us. The movie's upbeat music played in the background, a stark contrast to the storm inside of me. Ethan leaned in and placed his forehead against mine as his hand slid into mine. "I wanted this for so long," he whispered, his breath warm against my skin. "Tell me you want it too." I couldn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat, but my silence seemed to say enough for him. Slowly and carefully, he tilted his head and kissed me. At first it was soft, but it quickly deepened. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself get lost in the moment, the feeling of him, the way he seemed to fit perfectly against me. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, I looked into his eyes, my heart pounding. "We can't let this go too far," I said, though I didn't even believe the words myself. Ethan smiled, his hand gently cupping my cheek. "Then let's just stay here for now," he said, one moment at a time. In that moment, with his arms around me and the world fading away, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as impossible as it had seemed. The house was quiet that evening, wrapped in a stillness that made every sound louder, the soft creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the beat of my own heart echoing in my ears. Ethan was sitting across from me at the kitchen table. His presence filled the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. Dinner was long finished, but neither of us had moved. The space between us felt electric, and I could feel the tension building with each passing moment. I watched him as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the edge of his glass. There was a stillness to him, a quiet intensity that held me captive. "Sophie," he said at last, his voice low and steady, "neither can I stop thinking about what happened the other night. The kiss, the way his hands had held me like I was something important, and the way his lips had touched mine, igniting something I thought I had buried long ago, had been all I could think about. We shouldn't have allowed it to happen." I spoke, but it seemed hollow. Perhaps he didn't acknowledge it, but his eyes remained unblinking, and even if he pretended not to want to alter anything, I couldn't deny that the truth hung between us, indisputable and plain. I turned my head away and murmured, "This is dangerous for both of us," as my hands twisted together in my lap. When he halted in front of me, he got up and took a few steps across the narrow gap between us. He knelt down with his hands resting lightly on my knees and whispered, "Look at me," in a manner that was almost commanding, but I couldn't force myself to look up. His black eyes were filled with something raw and unguarded, and I felt myself unraveling beneath the intensity of it. I hesitated, but when I finally met his stare, the intensity of it left me breathless. "Tell me you don't feel this," he said, his hands slightly tightening on my knees. "Tell me you don't want this as much as I do." I couldn't. The words wouldn't have come because they would have been a lie. Instead, I trembled and brushed my hand against his cheek, and the electric contact sent a shiver through me that I couldn't hide. I whispered, barely audible, "Don't," he said in a firm but gentle tone. "Don't stop before I could overthink it," he said, leaning in and kissing me. His hands moved up my arms, pulling me to my feet as he kissed me, his body pressed against mine, leaving no space between us. The room seemed to shift as the tension in the air increased, and his hands found their way to my waist, their grip steady and deliberate. This kiss was deeper and more intense than the last one, and there was no hesitation or holding back this time. I felt the cool edge of the table pressed against my back as he guided me closer, his lips never leaving mine. The kiss deepened and sparks ran through me. His hands traced the curves of my hips, sending waves of heat through me. His hands traced the curves of my hips and the dip of my back each movement, leaving a warm sensation I couldn't ignore. Sophie, he murmured against my lips, his voice rough, filled with emotion. You're everything I've ever wanted. His words hit me like a flame catching dry wood, starting a fire deep inside me. My hands reached for him instinctively, fingers tangling his hair as he moved to kiss my neck, his lips brushing softly yet deliberately against my skin. The sensation was all consuming. Every moment between us seemed filled with energy that I could feel in the air. He leaned closer, his presence steady yet electrifying, as though every movement was an unspoken promise. His hand brushed against mine. The warmth of his touch sent a ripple through me, stirring something deep inside that I couldn't name. It felt like we were drawn to each other by an invisible force, a connection we couldn't deny. He stepped closer, his forehead nearly touching mine, his breath mixing with the quiet of the room. His voice broke the silence softly and filled with emotion. You're amazing, he said, his tone full of reverence. You don't even know how much my words caught in my thoughts. My thoughts were racing too fast to make sense of. His hands gently moved to my face, his touch light, as if he was afraid I might pull away. His thumbs brushed my cheekbones in a tender gesture that almost overwhelmed me. I couldn't look away from his eyes, filled with something raw, something unspoken. Ethan, I whispered, my voice shaking. I let myself breathe in his steady presence, his warmth, and the quiet comfort of knowing I wasn't alone. Then, gently, he pressed his hand over mine. This gesture meant more than words could express, as our connection deepened in the silence, growing naturally like a story that had been waiting to be told for the first time for so long. He nodded slightly, his voice barely audible. It's okay. The moment seemed to hang between us, still and fragile, but undeniably, he leaned in, and when his forehead fell against mine, time seemed to vanish.